In the beginning, when God created the heavens and the earth was a formless void, and darkness covered the face of the deep, while a wind from God swept over the face of the waters. And God saw that the light was good.
Would you pray with me? God, may the meditations of all of our hearts and the words of my mouth be acceptable to you, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. Friends, the story of creation is beautiful, and it is permeated by light that was brought out of darkness. Order that came from chaos, life being brought forward, filling the earth with vegetation and creatures and beauty. And there, in this beauty, the story tells us that God placed human beings in the center of all of it, calling us caretakers of it all. Wherever you might be in your theological journey as it relates to the story of creation, human beings are at the center of it all. It is up to us to care for it. When I lived in Connecticut, I had a beautiful vegetable garden, and often in the summers, I would sit between the tomatoes just to be in reflection, to be in silence, to be in the presence of nature, just to be. I often would say I was sermonizing in the middle of the tomatoes. I found a place of renewal sitting there in my garden. These days, I feel like I am sitting hypothetically in the middle of the wilderness. At this moment, light has not come out of darkness, and order has not replaced the chaos. And this preacher is without words. Or better said, at this moment, like my grandmother used to say, las palabras sobran. It feels like words are superfluous. And what happens when one is without words but must speak? One goes right to the point. And that is what I'm going to do this morning. Friends, God has placed us in the center of creation. God has given us the directive to take care of it. That includes everything and everybody. But we have failed at that task. Most importantly, we have failed to love and take care of each other as we should. And so where do we go from here? Our streets are filled with protesters. The world is filled with protesters asking for justice for George Floyd, calling for an end to racism, asking for change. And so this morning I ask all of us, I ask that you join me in coming forward with 2 admissions and confessions. First, we must confess that we have failed to value God's children as God's own. And second, we must admit and confess that this nation that declares itself to be the best nation in the world was built under the ethos of white supremacy, and we have denied it and dismissed it. Scholars use the term white supremacy to describe a socio-political economic system of domination. And Ta-Nehisi Coates writes about this, and he says, to ignore the fact that one of the oldest republics in the world was erected on a foundation of white supremacy, to pretend that the problems of a dual society are the same as the problems of unregulated capitalism, is to cover the sin of national plunder with the sin of national lying. The lie ignores the fact that reducing American poverty and ending white supremacy are not the same. He writes, white supremacy is not merely the work of hot-headed demagogues or a matter of false consciousness, but a force so fundamental to America that it is difficult to imagine a country without it. Friends, I told you that this preacher was without words. And what happens when one is without words, but you must speak? You go right to the point. So now we know that white supremacy is in the DNA of this country. And so this moment calls for a new playbook. Already the bodies of Black and brown people have been vilified, hunted, lynched, and infected. And this time is time for solidarity. And what does this mean? In the words of Sean Copeland, solidarity begins in anamnesis, which means the intentional remembering of the dead, the intentional remembering of the exploited, the despised, the victims of history. What is happening in America can be stopped if those who hold privilege would use that privilege for justice and become allies. And I know what you're thinking. Some of you are asking yourselves, how can I become an ally? How can I be a true ally? In her book, White Fragility, Robin DiAngelo has some suggestions. She says, minimize defensiveness, demonstrate vulnerability, demonstrate curiosity and humility, allow for growth, stitch your worldview, ensure action, build authentic relationships, interrupt privilege. Interrupt privilege also that protects comfort. Interrupt internalized superiority. I would add, understand that when you put your body on the line, you will live. A person of color may not. Use your privilege to save lives. Friends, this preacher is without words. And what happens when you're without words, but you must speak? You go right to the point. the blood of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, and too many others. Black and brown bodies are crying out to God from the ground. And so too are the thousands who have disproportionately died from COVID-19. Sometimes you may not have the words. Sometimes you just need to sit in the middle of the wilderness. But remember, God has created you, and you are God's. And so the question remains, would the real allies please stand up? Amen.